All right, more fun with Rudolf Steiner, reincarnation, karma, and astrology. Now, we've gone through Steiner's angelology quite a bit here. This Father, Son, and Holy Spirit is nonsense. It shouldn't even be here. Steiner, like the Gnostics, downgrades Yahweh. In Steiner's case, he puts Yahweh as a moon god, as one of the beings that was on the moon, who were Luciferic beings who were there on the earth, not in physical form, but they had etheric bodies on the earth before the moon separated from it. And the sun for him is one of the powers, and they are sun gods. And the Holy Spirit is just irrelevant completely. Steiner's a polytheist, and this is his angelology here. First, he has three hierarchies, just as on the physical plane there are three hierarchies: the mineral, the plant, the animal world. With man in between. Man is the highest on the physical plane, but the lowest being on the astral plane. And so here we have seraphim, cherubim thrones, as he renames them, spirits of love, harmony, and will. Dominions, virtues, and powers, as he renames them, spirits of wisdom, motion, and form. Archai, archangels, and angels, which are the closest to man, spirits of personality, fire, and twilight. These are the beings who have created human beings. Now, is this idea that the human life cycle occurs in 7-year intervals, which corresponds perfectly with Saturn, and it still amazes me that he never picked up astrology because it would have fit perfectly. But I guess with him it was one esoteric system too many. So he relates each of these hierarchies to the human life cycle. So every 7 years something happens to the physical body. At the age of 7, the child loses its teeth, and it frees up the etheric body, which had been used to form the child's body. Now it can be used more for the memory. So reading and writing should begin at age 7. At 14, the astral body, with all its passions and desires, is unleashed with sexuality. At 21, the brain becomes fully mature. It's stopped maturing, which is probably why the drinking age is 21. Damage that is done to the brain from alcohol before the age of 21 can harm it, and so forth. So it's every 7 years. But here, what he does in one of these lectures here, Karmic Relationships Volume 2, is that he says the human life cycle can be broken down into 3 distinct phases. And he says in children, in this first phase, the animal element predominates, growth and vitality, whereas in old age, the mineral element predominates. There's a mineralizing process that takes place in old age, where the old person is becoming sclerotic, a hardening process sets in, and the mineralizing process begins to overtake the individual again. And in between is the plant-like process of vitality in between the ages of 14 and 35. So he divides the human life cycle into 0 to 21, and then then it overlaps 14 to 35, and then 28 to 49. After that, other things happen, which we'll get into. So for the first life cycle, that first period of 0 to 21, the lower hierarchy, the third hierarchy of archai, archangels, and angels are the ones that predominate, and they are the ones that are sending energies into the nerves and senses system, which is the brain, although that system radiates out through the whole body, all the way down to the toes, obviously, but it's localized in the head. And in the next life cycle, in the middle period, which overlaps 14 to 35, the middle hierarchy, that second hierarchy, predominates. The Kyriotets, Dynamis, and Exousiae, which are the terms he uses, that's what predominates in the middle period. And then in the third period, we have another overlap from 28 to 49, where the seraphim, cherubim, and thrones are the ones who are doing the governing. And he says that karmic demands are made in that first cycle from 0 to 21. Those are when karmic demands that have been inscribed on the soul before incarnation are impressed further into the soul and spirit by that lower hierarchy, the angels, archangels, and archai. And then the karmic fulfillments actually don't take place until 28, which is your Saturn return, to 49. And so from 28 to 49, Saturn return to 49, those are when whatever karmic agreements that you had before you came down here and incarnated on the physical plane are fulfilled or not fulfilled. And the ones that don't get fulfilled, you got to do it again the next time until you get it right. Okay, and then so the nerves and senses system, then the rhythmic system is worked on in that middle period, the heart, the circulation of the blood, and then finally the karmic fulfillments, the third phase, has to do with the metabolic system, the limbs, the movement of the limbs. Now he says that there are also planets, the planets themselves, and he ignores Uranus and Neptune. He knew about them, he just didn't think. He thought they were aberrations, and he died before the discovery of Pluto. That there are certain of the planets that predominate during each of these phases. The moon predominates from age 0 to 7 for obvious reasons. It's the growth, the principle of growth. And then from 7 to 14 we have Mercury. The brain is slowly maturing, learning how to read and write and so forth. And then at 14 to 21, Venus brings in the sexual energies. And then there's this period of 21 to 42, which is the longest of these periods, and it's the sun period. This is the period of the apogee of the human life cycle. And then from 42 to 49, Mars comes in, and then from 49 to 56, now remember the previous model ended at 49, so here he's continuing with Jupiter and Saturn. 49 to 56 we have Jupiter, and 56 to 63 we have Saturn. And I think Steiner died at the age of 64, if I remember right, 63 or 64 in 1925. And all these lectures are given in 1924. Okay, so now what he wants to do is get into some illustrations. And what he says is that, okay, so when you die and you go to the other side, the first thing that happens, and every medium that I have spoken with has confirmed this, is a life review. It doesn't take very long. They don't have time and space over there. But measured by Earth standards, it would be about 3 days for the etheric body to disintegrate. But first it shows you what your life was. You experience all the pain that you caused other people from their point of view, which is comforting. If you were a serial killer, you get to experience what you did to other people. Isn't that cosmic justice? So in a way, good and evil are kind of irrelevant. The universe takes care of its own laundry. It all comes out in the wash. So then once, and that requires, he has 3 upper faculties called Imaginative Cognition, which has to do with thinking in terms of pictures and myths and images. Inspiration, which has to do with hearing the voices of the higher beings, the angelic beings. And intuition, which has to do with being able to see into past lives, your past lives, other people's past lives, and so forth. So imagination is involved in the pictorial images that you are shown of the life that you have just lived. And you are your own judge. What's satisfactory to you is satisfactory to you. What's dissatisfactory is dissatisfactory only to you. So it's up to you how you want to alter and adjust that karma for the next incarnation. So what happens is that after that etheric body disintegrates, you live through a period where your karma gets worked out with these other beings, and it lasts for a third of however long you lived. Let's say you died at the age of 60. This process takes about 20 years then of working out your karma, and it's worked out through these spheres. or whatever they are. They're not planets on the other side, but they correspond to the planets. They correspond to their frequencies and their archetypal dimensions. You work through the moon energies. You work through the Mercury energies. You work through the Venus and Sun energies. Now here he picks up with the Mars energies, which he agrees with traditional astrology that has to do with aggressiveness. And he says there was an individual who lived, and here we're studying, remember, Voltaire, Eliphas, Levi, and Victor Hugo as illustrations of Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, each one of these individuals. So there was an individual who lived in the 9th century who was Islamic and studied at the same school in North Africa that Augustine did, and he learned all kinds of esoteric Islamic wisdom. But then he went on up into Spain, where he studied and he fell in love with and studied Jewish Kabbalah, especially an earlier version of it, a very early version of it. I think this is the 9th century. So he learned Kabbalah, studied it. Then when he went to the other side, he had to take that he took that Kabbalistic wisdom with him. And when he went to the sphere of Mars, it particularly amplified at the sphere of Mars, the aggressive energy of Mars. And this individual reincarnated as a woman at some point a few centuries later, where this knowledge sank in deeper, and then reincarnated as Voltaire. So let's take a look at the Wikipedia article on Voltaire. Born 1694, dies in 1778. His original Voltaire was not his original name. His name was François-Marie Arouet. And he changed his name to Voltaire, which is much easier to remember. And let me add this synchronicity in before we go any further, which is, you're going to think I'm making this up. But after I read this passage on Voltaire in the middle of this chapter, I stopped and I went to the store. So I go to the store and I'm sitting at the intersection waiting for the light to change. I look over on the corner. There's these 3 Hispanic teenage girls on the corner. I'm going straight across. The left turn lane goes then. The green light goes for the arrow for the left turners. My window's open. Beautiful day out. So this van goes past me, and this kid yells across to one of the girls on the intersection, "Goodbye, Voltaire!" I kid you not. I couldn't even have made that up if I had tried. That's about as synchronicitous as a synchronicity gets. And so Voltaire now was a rationalist. He defines rationalism, even though he wasn't quite fully an atheist. He was a deist, but deism, let's face it, is a kind of a parody of religion, because all it is this idea that God created the world and then ditched it. It created it, set it spinning, and then said, "I'm out of here." What a waste of time. Why would a God do that? So it's a joke. It really isn't a religiosity at all. And our founding fathers were deists as well as Freemasons, most of them. But it's a joke. It's a total parody of a religion. So he incarnates with all this intellectual aggressiveness from his going through the Mars sphere on the other side before he incarnated. So there's a lot of intellectual aggressiveness, and indeed Voltaire was a fighter, especially against Catholicism. He left France and went to England, where he liked the multiculturalism in England. He liked that there were all these different religions. Trade for him, economics was the uniting thing, not religion. People, for the most part there, left each other alone as far as their religions went, left each other alone. So Voltaire is associated with liberal values like multiculturalism, and he was against idolatry, and he was against fanaticism, and he was against anything that had any ring of the supernatural about it. So he was totally against the paranormal, and his famous book is, of course, Candide, which is the only one of his books I've read. I would not bother with somebody this shallow in a million years. But Candide is a book about the quest for one happy person. And Candide is the main character, and he has a professor named Pangloss. And Pangloss is an optimist. And here, when Voltaire writes this book, he's trying to refute the ideas of Leibniz, who had written in the Theodicy that this is the best of all possible worlds, otherwise God wouldn't have made it. Voltaire didn't believe that. Voltaire was more of a pessimist. And so the book is about, and it's a very short book, about a quest for one happy person. And every now and then the two of them will stumble across someone who appears to be happy, but then they'll interview them, talk to them, and find out that they're not happy at all. So neither Candide nor Pangloss find one happy person. So this is the point of view of a rationalist. It's a shallow, empty philosophy. Voltaire personifies all the values of the Enlightenment, especially what Oswald Spengler would call the Socratic man. Just empty. You can't do anything with it. It's just emptiness. So now, Eliphas Levi. Eliphas Levi was born in 1810, died in 1875, and he's one of these guys that I dislike that are kind of like Aleister Crowley and John Dee, who are magicians, which is something I care nothing for. But so, all right, so in a past life then, so now we're talking about the Jupiter sphere. So we've moved from the Mars aggressiveness. I forgot to mention Voltaire's chart. I checked Voltaire's chart to look for that Mars aggressiveness, and there it is. I found it. Mars conjunct Mercury. That's intellectual aggressiveness. It's right there on Voltaire's chart, and it's directly opposed by Uranus, which could either destabilize it or make it a breakthrough. So, I forgot to mention that little detail about looking. And it's funny because it totally backs up what Steiner said about Voltaire's relationship with Mars, but Steiner had no truck with astrology, so he would not have consulted it. So with Eliphas Levi, then, we're moving into the sphere of Jupiter, which is next. And he lived to be age 65. So he experienced the Jupiter sphere, which on Steiner's chart is 49 years old to 56 years old. So he would have experienced it. And for him, the Jupiter beings are weavers of wisdom. They're beings that have to do with the weaving of wisdom. So when he looks into Eliphaz's past life, he sees him as what he calls a Mexican, part of the Mexican civilization, which would have been another word back then for the Mesoamerican civilization, probably Mayan, or Aztec, I guess, in this case, because Steiner regards it as totally degenerate. He says that the Mexican civilization at this point was just in a state of total degeneracy. And I would say that Gene Gebser would probably agree with him. This is probably the Aztec period, not the Mayan, which was degenerate. This is other than Egypt, I think what Gene Gebser called the magical consciousness structure was the strongest in both of these two civilizations. It survived over from the Neolithic with a mythical layer laid on top of it, like sedimentary strata. And so, I agree with him that by the time of the Aztecs, it was probably pretty degenerate. But he was a master in the mysteries of the Aztec mysteries, however they existed at that time. They were degenerate. But then he goes to the other side, and as he's on the other side, he goes through the Jupiter. He gets to the Jupiter sphere, and in him, the Jupiterian element of the weaving of wisdom becomes predominant, so that when he comes back, and he doesn't have an interim incarnation, when he comes back as Eliphas Levi, he's much more sophisticated in the occult. So I looked at his chart as well to make sure, to see if Jupiter is particularly aspected, and it is. Here's his Jupiter, and it's trining Neptune conjunct Saturn, which would be spiritual discipline, or in one sense magic. and it's trining Jupiter. And then Jupiter is sextiling this little cluster here, this aggressiveness of Pluto conjunct Mars with the moon. So this aggressive little cluster of and these aggressive energies of Pluto and Mars would be going through his emotions and sextiling Jupiter, so that Jupiter was mega powered by that sextile and that trine with Saturn and Neptune. So that's makes perfect sense. So Steiner's moving right along here as far as I'm concerned with these guys. So then he talks about Victor Hugo, who was born in 1802 and 1885 and famous for writing Les Miserables and The Hunchback of Notre Dame, but a whole bunch of other stuff too. And he says Victor Hugo was actually an initiate in the Hibernian mysteries, the Irish mysteries. He doesn't give the date. I'm guessing probably 8th or 9th century, where he says there was this weird thing. The initiates had these two different statues. He doesn't say what they were made out of, but he says the initiate on one statue had to touch it, and it felt like human flesh. And you could touch it, and then it would make an indentation, and then the indentation would come back, just like you were touching a body. A very unpleasant experience for the initiate. Then in the other statue, he said, you would touch it, and the indentation would stay there until you came back again, and it would be gone. And then you would have to make new indentations. So whatever the Hibernian mysteries were, they were very weird. And he doesn't say what those statues were made out of. But now, when Victor Hugo went to the other side and he got to the sphere of Saturn, he made it to the sphere of Saturn. He was long-lived. He lived to be 83 years old, 1802 to 1885. When he got to the sphere of Saturn and brought that wisdom of the Hibernian mysteries with him, Saturn, Steiner says, has to do with the past. It has to do with, and this isn't altogether that far off from its astrological meaning. In astrology, Saturn has to do with form, discipline, death, authority, the grumpy old king, let's say, whereas Jupiter is the positive king, the king in a good mood. So he took this knowledge with him into the Saturn sphere. And then when he reincarnated as Victor Hugo, he became a romanticist obsessed with the past. And so if we look at some of his works here, I've never read him. In addition to The Hunchback of Notre Dame, which is set during the Gothic period, we've got all kinds of books about, historical figures. Cromwell. We've got something about Napoleon the Little. A book about Shakespeare. All this kind of stuff that has Torquemada, Lucretia Borgia, Murray Tudor. The guy's obsessed with the past, and he's one of the first romantics. So Steiner got this right. So now I looked at his birth chart to see if Saturn was in particularly aspected, and of course it is. He has Saturn conjunct Jupiter, and Jupiter expands anything that it gets near, and it's in direct opposition to this little power cluster here of Pluto, Venus, and the Sun. Pluto would give the obsessiveness in opposing Saturn. With Pluto opposing Saturn, there's a very strong interest in very severe situations or individuals in situations of confinement. And you would think that the Saturn opposing the Venus would block his aesthetic drive, his aesthetic impulse, but Jupiter's right there to balance it out. Optimism and pessimism, let's say, are perfectly balanced, but opposed by this powerful stellium right here with Victor Hugo. So the birth charts back up what Steiner has to say, and those are the past lives of those three individuals: Voltaire and Victor Hugo and the other guy. Okay, So that's it for that chapter.